Hi everyone. Sorry I didn't get this up earlier. I had a 2-week bout of not being able to talk very well. So my voice is back, and this lecture is entitled Beavers and Bibles, the Settling of New England, as to be distinguished from the Chesapeake settlements by the English. These are both English settlements. The Chesapeake, as we talked about, was largely a business settlement. They were searching for gold at first, and then finally they found tobacco. In New England, we'll see the settlement of religious sects that are looking for a place to start their own societies, their own worlds. So we'll see both the Pilgrims and the Puritans in this. We'll start with the Pilgrims first. I know we get a lot about that in school, but we will look a little bit at the Pilgrims, and then we'll turn to the Puritan settlement in Boston. The Pilgrims settled the area that we call today Rhode Island during the era of James I. He was the first of Stuart kings who demanded, as we looked earlier, a absolute rule. So he wanted complete control of government, and in a nation that had had a practice of the parliament limiting the powers of the king. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Pilgrims were radical separatists, so they were likely to be persecuted even by the Anglicans in England itself. And remember that the British monarchs, the Stuarts, were Catholic origin, even though obviously they had to be Anglican to be rulers. Radical separatists means that they were a religious sect that thought the other Protestant religions, the Anglican religion in particular, were still not practicing according to the authority of the Bible. And so they felt that they needed to be separate from those societies that were corrupt. And so that's why we call them radical separatists. And they had some of their own particular religious beliefs. I'm not too concerned about that with the Pilgrims. More important is that they felt that they might be persecuted. So they attempted 2 different times to get out of England to find some place where they wouldn't be persecuted. In 1608, the Pilgrims went to Holland to set up communities and found that it was very difficult to set up a community in a place that already had a well-developed society. And so they were, like other immigrants, struggling with getting jobs and providing for their families. They ended up in the very low-income jobs. And so in Holland, it was just a tough struggle. So they set out to establish the Plymouth plantation in modern-day Rhode Island as a second place. So they left Holland, some of them, and they joined up with other Pilgrims in England. Some of them were wealthy enough to help to buy a ship, and the ship was called the Speedwell. And they took the ship, they took 2 ships actually, and one of them didn't work very well, all the way to the Plymouth area. The ship that made it was, of course, called the Mayflower, and they would sign the Mayflower Compact. At first, they wanted to establish their expedition by the Virginia Company, and they did get some financing from the Virginia Company, but most of it was Pilgrim money. So they used the model of the Virginia Company to create a joint stock company. It's important to know that the joint stock company was not just a commercial enterprise, but also that religious sects could join together in a joint stock company. They took the Mayflower over to the Americas, and they landed in Plymouth. They would sign a Mayflower Compact before they got off of the ship, which was basically like their constitution, what they're basically a charter amongst themselves, and we're going to have a look at that in just a second. Also, another thing to note about the Plymouth settlement was that they went north of where they were supposed to have settled under James the first charter with them, so that they might be outside the legal restrictions of James the First charter. And they knew exactly, that's the important thing about the Astrolabe, they knew exactly that they were going north of where James the First had claimed control of the territory. So they escaped him, and they made their own compact, their own agreement, and they were effectively at first a charterless colony. So they didn't have a charter with the king. The leader of the Pilgrims was William Bradford, and he was the architect of the Mayflower Compact and the Pilgrim civilization in what is today Plymouth, Massachusetts, actually. Sorry, I said Rhode Island earlier. It's Plymouth, Massachusetts. Remember, I don't talk too much about the Pilgrims. The first year was bad. The second year they had a good harvest. And part of the reason was that the Native Americans had helped them to learn to cultivate the infertile soils of the New England region. So by the second year, they had learned techniques like using fish as fertilizer and the crops in the area, so squash and corn. So they had learned to cultivate those things, and they celebrated with Native Americans, and they found a way to make money into Europe by the beaver trade. The beaver trade would be a big trade for the New England region to make money on a global scale, so they could trade beaver furs, especially into Europe. This is the Mayflower Compact. If you're looking at this in the small video, you might not be able to see it. You might want to go to the large one, or you can just pick up a Google Mayflower Compact and it will show that. But there are a few things that I want to illustrate about this Mayflower Compact. In fact, there are 3 things I want to illustrate about it. The first thing is you'll read it. It starts out, "We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of the dread," and it goes on introducing who the people are. But if you get down to about the 4th line, it says, "Do by these presents covenant and combine ourselves in a civil body politic." So the British very much understood that it was a civil and not a religious government they were making, and that's what body politic means. We are going to make a civil government together here for the ordering, preservation, furtherance, right? As you get down, they say that they're going to constitute and frame equal laws. So there's the notion of equality here, right? So you've got people who are making a secular, or understand that there is a notion of a secular government, civil, that the laws should be equally applied across the board, right? And then finally they say for the meat and convenience for the general good of the colony. So everything was should be enacted for the general good. Now that's a vague term, I understand, but nonetheless they understood that government was established with equal laws and for the general good of the people that were under those laws. Okay, so those are the things that are the most important about the Mayflower Compact, that you can see with the Pilgrims and with the British in general, that they have specific ideas of what the obligations of government are. All right, so let's move on. That's the Mayflower Compact. That's a short on the Pilgrims. The Puritans would follow them in the 1630s. The Puritans were not quite as radical as the Pilgrims, but nonetheless they still quibbled with the Anglican Church, and I think that's the big thing about the Puritans, that they thought the Anglican Church was not representing the Bible authentically, that it was corrupted partly because of the wealth and the politics involved in the Anglican Church. And so the term Puritan actually in part means to purify, and then purify what? They meant the Anglican Church, to expiate or get rid of all the corruption. Now the Puritans also have a second thing about them, that they were The Puritans believed in predestination in a Calvinist way. So we often say that the Puritans were Calvinists, and I'll talk about that in a second. But they believed you were predestined either for hell or for heaven. Okay? So Puritans are Calvinists. They wanted to purify the Anglican Church. They believed that everybody was on this earth for a purpose. And that's what the word calling means, that you have a purpose on this earth that was given to you by God, and you had an obligation to fulfill God's mission. And they mean that in every sense of the word. So they meant that a blacksmith was put on this earth to do the best blacksmithing, metal working work that he could do. A window maker, a house maker, everything in that society. Let's see, a merchant, a storekeeper. Everybody had a calling, and they were to do it for God's glory. Right? They also believed that they were the chosen ones. They were what the Calvinists said were the elect, that those people that were destined for heaven in this religion that believes you were predestined for either hell or heaven were considered by the Puritans, they used the term visible saint. So all of them would have been on any given day wanting to prove they were visible saints. They settled the Boston region under Charles I. He was brother to James I, and he became the King of England in 1625. The Puritans would settle Boston in 1630, and Charles I was no different from his brother in the sense that he had Catholic origins, and that he felt that the kings should have more control than the parliamentarians or the people in Parliament felt they should have. The Puritans would get a royal charter at first, and then they would be free of it, and then they'd be back to a royal charter. A royal charter means, as we've said before, that you have a contract with the king. So the king, by this time, by the 1630s, claimed the region that is today Massachusetts, and they signed a royal charter which gave the king the right, usually to make a governor. In this case, it didn't quite yet, but they would try to make a governor for Massachusetts. They formed a joint stock company of Calvinists who gave money. It was called the Massachusetts Bay Company. Once again, the use of the joint stock company by a religion. They had over 1,000 people that came with them to Boston the first time, and they were led by the governor, John Winthrop. Now you guys have the first speech that John Winthrop gives in your packet, and it's called A City on the Hill. And you want to have a look at that. He is talking to the Puritans, once again, before they disembark from the boats that they're on to establish Boston. And he talks about how they will be a godly city and a model to the world, and that everybody must give up their own individual initiatives and wants and subsume themselves in the group. And that's usually what's pointed out in John Winthrop's speech, The City on a Hill, in our modern time, that it wasn't all about individualism when the colonies were founded, but that sometimes they were communal, and Winthrop's speech illustrates that. And Winthrop's speech also illustrates that the Calvinists thought they were making a model city and that they had to succeed, because if they failed in this mission, they failed God. Right? So there was a powerful religious zeal behind the success of the Bostonians, or the people in Massachusetts, which has to help explain why they were so successful. And then there are other things, but they were successful beyond all belief in Massachusetts. So people started coming to populate Massachusetts in a much bigger way than they did to the Chesapeake. All right, so have a look at City on the Hill speech, and be sure to note that it's communal, that he says your own individual interests are not important and the interests of the community are, and that they're hoping to set up a model religious community, and success meant everything. All right, the Puritans and the Calvinists in particular believe in theocracy, which means that they believe in that the ruling elite in the church should also be the ruling elite in the government. And that was a little bit problematic for England, which is why I gave you John Cotton's letter in 1636, 6 years after the establishment of the colony. John Cotton is writing to a parliamentarian, and if you read that carefully, and I think I might give you a little video to talk about that because it's a little bit difficult in the Old English to read, but if you read it carefully, he wants to say, "Don't worry, Lord say and Sele. We Puritans here understand that the civic government is separate from the religious government." And the reason he has to belabor that point and explore it thoroughly, I guess I should say, is because in England they're a little bit unsure what these Puritans will create as a government in the New World. So, and it's because, right, they're theocratic by their beliefs and their values as Calvinists. All right, so the leadership would be both religious and secular if you're in a purely Calvinist community. But the New England region and this Massachusetts Bay Company will establish the tradition of town halls. And that means the place where all people who are citizens and have the right to vote come to elect the people who will lead the community. And that's what a town hall is. And so it's the most democratic element that we have in the New World in the 17th century, are these town halls. What was required to be a voting citizen was that you were part of the church. There was no economic requirement in Boston at this time, so that meant it was very democratic because the poor and the rich could participate. And for their time, that was very important because in Parliament, in England, you had the House of the Lords, which was inherited, and it was the upper class elite, and even the Commons was appointed and sometimes inherited by an upper elite class. So in Boston, with these town halls, there was no economic requirement to participate. You came to the town hall and they engaged in voting on laws, on representatives. Sorry, not representatives, but on laws, right? So everybody who was a voting citizen was considered a free man, and that meant he was part of the Calvinist church, which meant he was a visible saint, right? So they called him freemen. The governor was elected originally by the community, and he was elected yearly, which is also radical democratic. Eventually the king would take that over. And then finally the laws that were enforced were considered to be God's laws as well. So not that they didn't have civic laws, but they couldn't pass a law that wasn't consistent with God's law, right? Finally, because they were so successful in their settlements, they had such a large population, and so many were outside of the church, that they developed what was called the halfway covenant, so that people who were not born into the Puritan church could join and then become part of the civil government as well. So you could enter the church on the halfway covenant. All right, there were many, many religious conflicts, and the New England region today is divided up into several different small states because it was settled by people who were trying to escape religious persecution because they had their own ideas about religion. So among them, they had a lot of people who had their own ideas about religion as well, and they would break off and form small states like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Connecticut and Rhode Island, but Massachusetts and Vermont are also somewhat radical. But one of the examples of religious conflict is Anne Hutchinson, and she fought with the ruling religious elite in Boston. And she was very much a critic of them, and that's what got her into trouble. Right? She was accused of what we call antinomianism. That means anti against, nomos in Greek. N-O-M-O-S means law, and it means law, not just written law or civic law, but also tradition and custom. So antinomianism means to act or to believe against the law. So she was accused of antinomianism. And what did that mean amongst the Puritans, right? She said that the leaders were not visible saints, that they were corrupt. She said that one's salvation, whether one was going to heaven or hell, was determined by inner grace, and so that would detach anything from any elite guidance. And she also said, and this is probably what got her into trouble, besides being a critic of the leadership, that she had direct revelations from God. So Anne Hutchinson said that she had communicated with God directly and knew things, and then that is problematic for all Christians because they do not believe that there is any sort of mystical conversations, mystical interactions that individuals on this earth would have with the divine. And I don't know how to put it any easier, but that is a heresy in the Catholic Church and in most Protestant religions. I think all Protestant religions, but since there's so many, I want to just hold back on saying all of them. All right, so she was banished from the Puritan community in Boston, and she and her family went to Connecticut and settled, and would later all be killed in an Indian attack on their home in Connecticut. So it was a pretty tragic life. She herself had many children, I think upwards of close to 10, and she even had what was called a monster birth, which was also something that the elites used against her. And a monster birth is a child, the birth of an infant that has, major deformities about it, and especially that part of their brain is outside of the skull, and things like that are considered monster births, or were in that day and age. I'm sure we don't call it that anymore. Another individual who had conflict with the Puritan community was Roger Williams. He would leave the Puritan community to establish Rhode Island. He wanted to break completely with the Anglican Church. The Puritans were still kind of linked to the Anglican Church, but he wanted to break completely, and he wanted to have much more tolerance in and among the religious community. Another person in conflict with the Puritans was Thomas Hooker, and he would establish the Connecticut region. He wanted to include people in the town halls and have a much more broader population, and he had a Bible-based community.